torture, mind control experiments, and even attempts to master the psychic realm. The US government has done some pretty cruel and bizarre things to people. But among the most terrible, mysterious, and puzzling actions undertaken on individuals were the CIA experiments on humans, which ended up sometimes destroying people's lives and even kicked off an unexpected new drug craze, all in an effort to get a competitive edge in the war on, well, everything. So follow along with us on this acid trip through the CIA's shady experimental past. First up is the top-secret program that ruined countless lives around the globe, MKUltra. At some point, the CIA became convinced that communists around the world had discovered and perfected some kind of mind control substance or technique to get people to ally with them and believe what they had to say. Something beyond, the time-honored use of propaganda. You may wonder what proof they had that this threat was a reality, and if you followed the history of reasons for US operations, you may not be surprised to know that the answer is very little proof. But since the early 20th century, people had become enraptured by this idea of hypnosis and mind control, a theme that's repeatedly popped up in media and sideshows, including movies like The Manchurian Candidate. So to many people in the government, mind control seemed like the next inevitable frontier in psychological warfare. In the view of the military and the government, the advantages of mastering mind control were enormous. As journalist Stephen Kinzer, who became one of the foremost experts on MKUltra, said about the project in an interview, they, the CIA, wanted to be able to have a truth serum that would make prisoners say everything they knew, also an amnesiac that would make people forget what they once had done, and most important, a technique or a drug that would allow the CIA to direct agents to carry out acts like sabotage or assassination, and then forget who had ordered them to do it, or even that they'd carried out those actions at all. So in response to this assumed threat from the Soviet Union, remember that in the mid-20th century, the way to get the US to do absolutely anything was to say, "This is so we can fight communism." The CIA launched MKUltra in the 1950s, and it ran up until 1963. The head and mastermind of the program was Sidney Gottlieb, a chemist by trade, who, as you'll soon find out, perhaps let his ego get the best of him, and that turned him into a bit of a Bond villain. According to Kinzer's investigation and these remaining documents, Gottlieb believed that to control the human mind, you had to completely destroy it first. Then, after you destroyed it, you needed to insert a new mind into your target human. So how did the destruction of minds and the reintroduction of a new brain go? Well, as Kinzer said, we didn't get too far on number 2, but he did a lot of work on number 1. Gottlieb used electric shock, flat-out torture, and drugs to work on destroying the human brain. His experiments also had some strange indirect outcomes. For starters, he almost single-handedly started the widespread use of LSD in the United States. LSD was a relatively new invention, as it had been created in a Swiss lab in Basel in 1943 by Dr. Albert Hofmann. When Gottlieb heard of LSD use and its effects, he was fascinated by the thought that this psychedelic might be an optimal drug to use in order to destroy or somehow rearrange the human brain in order to eventually induce mind control. Therefore, at the start of the 1950s, he decided that if he was going to make a bunch of people trip out on acid, he was gonna go big. He asked the CIA to buy LSD. In fact, he asked them to buy the entire global supply of the drug, all for a then price of $240,000, equivalent to approximately $2.8 million today. For whatever reason, the CIA heard this absolutely insane request and decided, yeah, that sounds about right, thus procuring Gottlieb's LSD for him. Now, we don't suggest you attempt this request with your own boss at work. Today's video is sponsored by Aura, and it's a really important time to be talking about them because hackers may have stolen the social security numbers of every American. Over 2.9 billion records were stolen, which includes a person's full name, address, date of birth, social security number, and phone number. And members of the hacker group have reportedly released this information for free online. If you weren't taking precautions with your personal information online before, this should be a huge wake-up call. You've never been more vulnerable online than you are right now. Speaking of vulnerability, I've been dealing with a flood of annoying spam texts about package deliveries that don't even exist. Now I know how these scammers got my number in the first place. But I'm not too worried about it anymore because I use Aura. Aura alerts me if they find my phone number, email, or social security number on the dark web. They're going to let me know fast if anyone tries to use this information to access my credit or bank accounts. They give me up to $5 million in identity theft insurance should the worst-case scenario happen. They also provide a bunch of other features to keep you safe online, all inside one app. You can go to my link aura.com/infographics to to try 14 days for free. That'll be enough time for Aura to find out if any of your personal data is exposed. I'm not leaving myself and my family vulnerable to data breaches or annoying spam texts. And if you don't want to either, you can go to aura.com/infographics to try Aura for yourself. Gottlieb then essentially fenced the drug, in a government-sanctioned, totally approved way of course, through hospitals, institutions, and prisons, as well as research foundations that he completely made up on the spot. Of course, people weren't being told the reason for this new medication that they were being given, as one of the most infamous victims of his experiments, Boston mobster and mass murderer Whitey Bulger, could confirm. After all, telling people, hey, take this pill so we can destroy your brain and eventually maybe come up with a way to mind control you, probably wouldn't get you too many volunteers. Bulger, for example, was told that this experimental new substance was a potential cure for schizophrenia. He volunteered to take it and subsequently ingested LSD every day for over a year, a frequency of usage that even the biggest rave attendees you know would probably side-eye. The point was to see if long-term use of LSD would destroy someone's brain. Keep in mind, no pun intended, the brain destruction wasn't being thought of as a potential unintended side effect, but rather the main point of such a treatment. After Bulger caught on that he was the US government's guinea pig, he wanted no part in the LSD experiment anymore. When you've successfully terrified a seasoned murderer and gangster biding their time in federal prison, perhaps you've gone a little too far. Of course, the fact that now even federal prisoners were rejecting drugs from him wouldn't deter Gottlieb in any way. He was seeing interesting effects on other subjects, after all, many of whom took the drug willingly. Then again, not being in prison certainly helped their choice in the matter. Gottlieb lying to them about what they were being given probably also had an effect. Allen Ginsberg, one of the greatest beat poets of his generation, first tried LSD thanks to Gottlieb, though he obviously did not know thanks to whom and for what reason he was given the drug in the first place. He started spouting the virtues of using LSD in order to go on mental adventures, as did another of Gottlieb's experimental users, Robert Hunter, better known as the Grateful Dead's lyricist. So even though the US government may have completely and abjectly failed in its initial aims, it did at least manage to open up a whole new drug market and subculture in the wake of its failed experiment. In fact, since a lot of artists and writers who were among the first to try LSD became prominent voices of the counterculture movement that started in the 1950s and eventually took hold of the entire country by the 60s, you could argue that by giving out these drugs, the US government unwittingly started one of the biggest protest movements against itself. In the words of Alanis Morissette, who was not around at the time to be experimented on by Gottlieb, isn't it ironic? At this point, you might be thinking, MKUltra doesn't even sound that bad. A bunch of artists and mobsters took LSD, and we got some cool music, movies, and potentially the entire hippie movement out of it. Unfortunately, that's pretty much it in terms of the more lighthearted parts of the experiment. Now, as your acid trip guru might tell you, we're gonna head down a much darker road. If you've ever brushed up on your 20th century history, you might recall other countries conducting some infamous human experiments during the whole kerfluffle known as World War II, specifically Japan and Germany, formerly the Axis powers. Since Gottlieb's project was somewhat based on the experiments conducted in Nazi concentration camps, which already signals a very wrong term in the setup of your human experimentation, as does the phrase human experimentation 9 times out of 10, they decided they might as well learn a thing or two from their former adversaries. Thus, the managers of MKUltra hired some former concentration camp workers, specifically torturers and vivisectionists, to come over to the US and explain how they had conducted their work, what they'd learned, and how they could help the CIA with a, well, new and improved way of mutilating people. Most of these former enemy soldiers and doctors came to Fort Detrick in Maryland, the headquarters of the project MKUltra. There, they engaged in fun lectures about how exactly mescaline worked on the human mind and the body in various doses, as well as how long sarin gas takes to kill a person. Since World War II was still fresh in people's minds, and the world was still in its settling down era after the war, the US realized it could use its unique post-war position in other ways as well. For example, the US still controlled or supervised large swaths of the former Axis powers to oversee a transition to peace, engage in Cold War shenanigans, and prevent renewed military buildup, as no one was all that keen on starting World War III anytime soon. Unfortunately, our current world has no such inhibitions. This made the CIA realize that they could test out some, well, let's say, unseemly techniques that they would like to use in Project MKUltra, far away from the prying eyes of most American citizens, on foreigners that the public generally cared little for. both because they were enemies up until recently and also because they spoke funny and it was the 1950s. Since the CIA was best suited to foreign operations in the first place, they decided that they'd get back to the basics and create secret detention centers in Europe and Asia, particularly in the countries of Germany, Japan, and the Philippines, where the US exercised the most control, meaning that those weak supervised local governments also couldn't really do or say much, even if the CIA experiments were to be discovered. And how did the CIA go about getting subjects for more experiments? Via capturing enemy agents, or anyone they suspected of being an enemy agent. The prisoners in foreign detention centers wouldn't just have to take LSD and go on several bad acid trips, though. Agents in those centers knew that they could push the boundaries and exert even more stress on these prisoners than was possible in the US, to make them lose their minds entirely. All for scientific purposes, of course. They would throw a bunch of drugs, known and experimental, at their subjects to test the effects and combine this with other methods like sensory isolation, electroshock, and extreme hot and cold temperatures. You may recognize some of these methods as being what a layman might call torture, but this wouldn't stop Gottlieb or the CIA on their quest for pure mind control to beat those gosh darn communists who may or may not have developed a similar technology. He guessed, maybe. In addition to physical techniques, agents would also try to mentally break down patients to see if they could destroy their ego and diminish their resistance to other people's suggestions. They would torture them while constantly bombarding them with questions, which, as anyone who has ever babysat a 4-year-old knows, that's kind of its own torture as well. So was the CIA on board with every single one of these methods? Well, yes and no. They had an inkling of what was going on, but they preferred to be blissfully in the dark, both for their own peace of mind and for any potential future journalistic exposés or Senate investigative committees. Gottlieb's boss, Richard Helms, as well as Allen Dulles, the director of the CIA at the time, had signed off on MKUltra and given Gottlieb a large amount of freedom in what he could do, which they enforced by pretty much never checking in on the specifics of the project. Unlike most government employees drowning in paperwork, Gottlieb never had to file detailed, frequent reports about developments in MKUltra. The CIA was so blinded by its quest for global domination and the urge to stick it to those Soviets in any way possible that it just didn't want to know. Those who have investigated the project suspect that many people died in those foreign detention camps while being experimented on under the approval of the US government, and nothing ever came of it at the time. In fact, according to later investigations, people ended up dying within the US as well. In 1977, a joint hearing was held before several U.S. Senate subcommittees on the operation, the effects and the secrets of Project MKUltra. Though Gottlieb destroyed most of the project files on his way out, several of them, specifically around 20,000, had survived due to sheer incompetence. They had initially been filed incorrectly and were in a storage space not meant for them, meaning that Gottlieb never managed to find those documents during his MKUltra purge. They were eventually found by Admiral Stansfield Turner, the director of the CIA, in 1977. In addition, in 1974, the New York Times launched an investigation into the CIA project and reported on the illegal activities taking place under the guise of MKUltra. For viewers too young to grasp this concept, this is what used to be known as journalism. No one has quite the funds, the will, or the patience for it anymore, but it was originally meant to determine the facts and hold powerful people and institutions accountable. Between the investigative reporting taking place at the time, the unearthed CIA documents, and committees and commissions launched in 1975 by Senator Frank Church and Vice President Nelson Rockefeller, the dark sides of Project MKUltra were brought to light. The CIA had spent approximately $20 million over more than 20 years, along with the assistance of researchers at more than 30 universities, to conduct the project. It was further discovered that at least one death, that of Frank Olson, was directly attributable to the project. Olson was a biochemist at a university who was given LSD in November 1953, though he was naturally never informed of it or asked for his consent. He eventually jumped out of a window during a psychotic episode, likely brought about by the drugs, though some of his family members allege that he was killed after he discovered details about MKUltra. In either case, the fault for Olson's death was squarely attributed to the operation of Project MKUltra. Officials and journalists who looked into the experiment concluded that even though they couldn't attribute specific other deaths to the project, the CIA's gross negligence in running the experiment, conducting follow-ups, and keeping patient safety in mind as well as the agency's general refusal to behave with an ounce of adult and medical responsibility, meant that there were likely many more people who died as a result of the project, whose names and identities will unfortunately never be found. While MKUltra is frequently covered and talked about online, fewer members of the public may be aware of Project Stargate. It took place during a later decade of the Cold War, occurring mostly in the 1970s and 80s. Though it still focused on the unlocking of the power of mind control, it ran a little bit differently than MKUltra. These decades were one of the peak eras for belief in psychic extrasensory perception, otherwise known as ESP, and other paranormal abilities. It was a time when psychics ran rampant, and Uri Geller would appear on television and pretend to bend spoons with his mind. Why the first thing anyone would care about after discovering that they have literal superpowers is bending cutlery is another question entirely. In 1972, during this ESP craze, a classified report was circulated among the US military and the government, stating that the Soviet Union was pouring millions of rubles into researching ESP and psychokinesis. As has already been made clear, the idea of the Soviet Union gaining an edge over the US in literally anything just would not have stood the test of time. So that same year, the CIA started investigating a very specific subset of paranormal abilities they called remote viewing. This involved testing people who alleged that they could see locations, people, and events around the world without actually being there in person, and without the use of FaceTime, which didn't exist, and it might have saved everyone a lot of time and energy. In essence, you had two superpowers competing to see who could unlock the power to read each other's minds first. The 70s were a very strange time. The CIA kept at the research for 5 years before handing it over to another agency, the DIA, Defense Intelligence Agency. The goals for the project remained more or less the same. First of all, determine how remote viewing can be used for intelligence gathering. Second, to see if other countries had mastered remote viewing and figure out ways to protect against it. And third, to experiment with ways to improve the skill of remote viewing if indeed it existed. After all, it's much easier to gather foreign intelligence if your spies don't even have to leave their armchairs to do it. It might make for a much less compelling James Bond movie, but it is a much more efficient of espionage in general. So how did Project Stargate work? Though it's always hard to get the full scoop on top-secret CIA experiments, we now have at least some answers thanks to some declassified documents. At least at one point in its multifaceted existence, the project included an activity chief, a senior intelligence officer, 3 remote viewers, an intelligence technician, and a secretary. Subjects had to sign a pretty long consent form agreeing to a long list of potential hazards, stating that the potential for injury during some training cannot be conclusively ruled out. Eventually, the DIA renamed the project from Stargate to Grill Flame, presumably because whoever was in charge of naming that day had a craving for Burger King. Over time, other names were given to the project, including Gondola Wish, Sunstreak, and Scan8. Over a decade of work, the DIA found itself in a bit of a dead end with a lot of inconclusive evidence, so it handed the program back to the CIA in the mid-1990s, making this one of the most recent top-secret experiments we've uncovered so far. The CIA took another look at the research that had already been conducted and even asked for an independent review from the American Institute for Research. The Institute's findings may surprise you somewhat, in that they didn't totally dismiss the potential existence of psychic phenomena such as remote viewing. In fact, in their final 183-page evaluation, the Institute arrived at the conclusion that remote viewing subjects were right more often than sheer chance would indicate, meaning theoretically, there was some evidence for remote viewing being a possible reality. However, the reviewers also concluded that the testing methods may have skewed the results, as researchers often used the same subjects, judges, and target photographs. Regardless of the potential existence of remote viewing, this assessment, coupled with lackluster results of over 20 years of experiments, led to the end of Project Stargate. Even few positives that the researchers had found in their studies were so sporadic and presented such a relatively weak correlation for remote viewing that it made the alleged power completely unusable for intelligence gathering. At least, that's what they've told us. But who knows, they might be watching you right now. The next CIA experiment is one of the most recent, having taken place during the post-9/11 War on Terror, and it's also one of the most brutal. The Physicians on Human Rights called it an experimental program based on untested and unproven theories. The research may have been crude, ad hoc, and based on poorly founded hypotheses, but it was research nonetheless. and made it clear they thoroughly disapproved and denounced the program. The CIA insisted they were simply experimenting with enhanced interrogation techniques. You may know this experiment more colloquially as torture. That's right, we're betting that a lot of people don't know that torture inflicted on prisoners abroad, mostly in the Middle East during the War on Terror, was actually somewhat of a human experiment. The experiment was on the effects of torture itself, as torture had actually previously been considered a wholly unreliable method of interrogation by many organizations, including the CIA itself, who had labeled it counterproductive in the past, a fact they conveniently forgot during the War on Terror. And yet, some people within the CIA and the US government, including contract psychologists James Mitchell and Bruce Jessen, started to promulgate the unsupported theory that prisoners and detainees could be broken in some way via a combination of psychological and physical methods. While prisoners were being tortured abroad, many times there would be health professionals present monitoring the methods of torture. Their presence was required for two reasons: one, to ostensibly prevent severe injury, at least beyond that was prescribed as acceptable by the US administration, and a second, to examine the tactics used and see which ones produced the best results. In other words, to oversee the experiment of torture. Since they were medical professionals, other physicians who found out about these experiments took offense, as overseeing torture doesn't really seem to align with the do no harm part of the Hippocratic Oath. The director of programs for Physicians for Human Rights, Dr. Homer Venter, said, "Health professionals applied their professional skills and engaged in research to aid torture. This was human experimentation on non-consenting prisoners who were being tortured, a crime within a crime." A subsequent government report on CIA operations during the War on Terror found that often medical professionals on hand didn't even help prevent severe injuries, as they let bullet wounds go untreated and allowed severe damage to be done to prisoners ostensibly under their care. Several U.S. government officials ended up equally appalled at the methods used to interrogate detainees when they eventually conducted an investigation. In 2012, the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, chaired at the time by Senator Dianne Feinstein of California, submitted a full report on the CIA's treatment of prisoners abroad that was declassified in 2014. Feinstein herself wrote that, while the Office of Legal Counsel found otherwise between 2002 and 2007, it is my personal conclusion that under any common meaning of the term, CIA detainees were tortured. I also believe that the conditions of confinement and the use of authorized and unauthorized interrogation and conditioning techniques were cruel, inhuman, and degrading. I believe the evidence of this is overwhelming and incontrovertible. Once again, it seemed that even most senior officials in the US government, especially those that, distressingly enough, would have had the most to say about the CIA program, were not fully informed of it. According to the report, the CIA provided extensive amounts of inaccurate and incomplete information related to the operation and effectiveness of the CIA's detention and interrogation program to the White House, the National Security Council principals, and their staffs. To the extent that the White House did not know what was happening, it also ordered the CIA not to inform several key staff members of the details of these enhanced interrogation techniques, including the Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense Colin Powell. In fact, one unearthed internal CIA email stated that the White House is extremely concerned Secretary Powell would blow his stack if he were to be briefed on what's been going on. And why is that? Well, perhaps because Secretary Powell, along with most other experienced officials who knew anything about gathering intelligence in wartime, would have both been horrified by the CIA's treatment of prisoners and also known that using torture to extract information is completely ineffective and counterproductive. Most of the interrogations took place in two secret detention facilities known as Cobalt and Salt Pit, located outside Kabul, Afghanistan. It's notable that the CIA placed mostly inexperienced junior officers in charge of the interrogation program, who mostly had no idea what they were doing. Even the chief of these detention sites, known as black sites, complained about the people he was getting sent from the CIA headquarters, stating that they were either problem underperforming officers, new totally inexperienced officers, or whoever seems to be willing and able to deploy at any given time, which produced mediocre or, dare I say, useless intelligence. The methods used included severe sleep deprivation, slamming detainees against the walls, imaginatively called wallings, keeping them in freezing conditions, physically assaulting detainees, threatening to kill them and their loved ones, keeping them in stress positions that involved them tied up in various uncomfortable positions for days on end, stripping them naked, as a method of humiliation, and the infamous waterboarding, which was incredibly dangerous and meant to simulate drowning. Shockingly, many prisoners ended up saying pretty much whatever the violent people threatening to kill their families wanted to hear in order to stop them from getting repeatedly punched and fake drowned. Whether the information was true or not was beside the point. In fact, after being starved and kept awake for 180 hours, we're not even sure most detainees would know who they were or where they are, never mind being able to divulge carefully concocted terror plots that they may or may not have any relation to. According to the Senate report itself, more often than not, detainees fabricated information resulting in faulty intelligence. Subsequent reviews of the identities of people actually held for questioning found that often the CIA actually knew very little about the prisoners, which is concerning, seeing as how you should probably be relatively certain of someone's identity before locking them away in a cell and repeatedly beating them, or, maybe just don't do that at all. However, to justify the continuation of the program, the CIA often misrepresented the results of these enhanced interrogation techniques to the White House, Congress, or the DOJ, and several other government branches, often touting their effectiveness. They insisted that the use of these torturous methods had obtained very important information on enemy movements, resulted in the foiling of several terrorist plots, and were absolutely crucial for saving lives. A review of the actual information the CIA claimed to have obtained from detainees found that the agency's claims were, at best, severely misleading and at worst outright lies. The Senate Committee on Intelligence looked into 20 of what the CIA claimed were its top counterterrorism successes and found that either 1. The information obtained via torture and the counterterrorism success had literally nothing to do with each other, 2. The information obtained via torture simply confirmed things the CIA already knew and had therefore been available to the agency before they subjected human beings to such cruel human conditions, or 3. The information had been acquired from a detainee prior to the use of enhanced interrogation techniques, meaning the CIA had acquired the useful information it needed and then chose to torture the people anyway. Of course, this only applied when the information extracted was remotely true in the first place, which, as we've established, it often wasn't. The CIA would actually frequently hide intelligence received from sources other than tortured detainees in order to make the experiment with enhanced interrogation techniques seem more effective, when in reality they had obtained the information another way. As the war in Iraq and Afghanistan continued, it became clear that not only was the CIA's experiment with torture cruel and inhumane, but it was actually actively hampering anti-terrorism efforts. In addition to completely incorrect information the CIA was extracting from prisoners and then feeding back to the US as reliable intelligence, the fact that the CIA kept several government departments out of the mix to avoid revealing the horrific nature of some of their interrogation techniques to other branches made interagency cooperation almost impossible in many cases. However, other agencies were also negligent in how much they let the CIA run rampant with their interrogations without oversight. While the CIA repeatedly provided inaccurate information about both of the techniques they were using on detainees and the information acquired via torture to the Department of Justice, the DOJ also did not conduct independent analysis or verification of the information it received from the CIA, a strategy that has so far worked out wonderfully when applied to Boeing by the FAA. Not only did dozens of people suffer because of the CIA's insistence on an inhumane and horrific experiment, accurate numbers are hard to obtain, but many estimates of over 119 men were held in these secret detention facilities and subjected to the CIA's interrogation methods, but at least one detainee actually died during the process. On November 20, 2022, a man named Gul Rahman died of hypothermia in a site known as the Salt Pit north of Kabul, Afghanistan, where temperatures had plummeted to around 36 degrees Fahrenheit while he was partially naked and chained right onto a freezing concrete floor. His daughter stated that Rahman had been incorrectly identified as a militant, and her family didn't even know her father had died until the US declassified the Senate's report on CIA interrogation methods in 2014. Until then, they still held out hope that he was missing and would return home. Rahman's family, as well as the family of 2 other survivors of the CIA's torture methods, successfully sued the psychologists who had been instrumental in creating the CIA's torture program. Though some of the CIA's experiments on humans may seem odd and downright ridiculous, we must always keep in mind that real people suffered as a result of many of them. The US's fear of being attacked or surpassed by enemies has led to a lot of questionable decisions in the nation's past. A good thing to keep in mind when those fears pop up again. Now check out 50 insane facts about the CIA you never knew, or watch this video instead.